once again say good morning. Welcome to the Ann Arbor Station Environmental Review Leadership Advisory Group meeting. This is the first of 3 meetings that are scheduled in the next 2 days. We're going to have a citizen work group meeting this afternoon, same room, 6:30, and a public meeting for all interested citizens, public or otherwise, at 6:30 tomorrow in the Juror Assembly Room in the Justice Complex.
Could I suggest, since you're not using a microphone, that you speak up a little?
I will do the best I can to project. I've never been told that I was not easy to hear. So we'll keep that in mind. The primary purpose of the meeting here this morning is for the project team to share with you an overview of the 200-page report that's available on the project website. There's also a hard copy right at the city clerk if you care to look at that either during or after the meeting. I'd suggest during the meeting might not be good because then you'll miss the proceeding of the event. I've got Bob Gorski, who's with AECom, and he is the project lead from our consulting team. He'll be walking through the presentation, and then Bob and I will also be available to answer questions. I want to be crisp and clear at the beginning that although this is a meeting that's being recorded, that the environmental review comments are best if they're provided to the city in writing, and that information will be provided as part of the presentation. It's been part of all the meeting notices, and this way we will be able to have your words available as part of the record for the FRA as we compile the results of all of our engagement as we've been engaged in this public process, and it will remain open through November 2nd. Also want to, and this may be a little different, you probably don't hear this at a lot of public meetings, I would like to apologize and congratulate you for your persistence and your stamina. It was over a year ago, last week, and anticipated that this report would have been subject to public review for a variety of reasons. In coordination with MDOT, the federal government, we had to refine some of the information, and that resulted in a delay. But that we have extended the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, requirements for an EA require a 30-day public review. Because it's taken as long to get the information, and when you look at the EA and the appendices, it's quite voluminous. We extended the public input process to 45 days, and so we'll continue to take public comments through November 2nd. I would ask or remind everybody if you could please sign in. For those of you who aren't sure if you're members of the Leadership Advisory Group, please be mindful that this is a Leadership Advisory Group meeting, and that the primary dialogue will be between the project team and the committee members. As a public meeting, we will provide time near the end of the meeting for any public comments that are intended to be offered for our consideration. But as I say that, we'll be listening. The meeting's being recorded. Again, for your comment to be part of the written record, we would encourage you to submit your comments in writing. With that, are there any questions before I turn it over to Bob? Mr. Gorski, it's all yours.
Thanks, Eli. Good to see everybody. Glad everybody got here safely. Anyhow, so like Eli said, it's been since September last year since we last saw each other. So just quickly, here's an agenda of what we're going to walk through. Part of it is just giving you an update, walking through the environmental assessment, as Eli said, is here available publicly through the city clerk's office. It's online. I have a couple copies of it right here if folks want to page through it while they're here. Talk about the preferred alternative that's included in that EA. What's going to happen after November 2nd, after the end of the comment period, and then we'll open it up to questions. So purpose of this meeting is just, to present this draft assessment. It's been out for about 2-3 weeks now, which included that preferred alternative, outline the next steps, So what have we been doing since September of last year? A lot of it revolved around the alternative analysis, where we were looking at a number of different sites, and ultimately what concluded was we came up with a finite group of alternatives that were all going to be processed through the environmental assessment. Where we're at now is just, it's finally been released. The FRA has actually signed off on that document, making it an official document, and we've started this 45-day review period that will end on the 2nd. So really, we're just looking to solicit comments from the public. So everything needs to go to Eli, either email or mailed. I have a couple of comment cards here. We can take comments here. We can write and collect them too. But ultimately, there's potential of this de minimis related to the Fuller Road Park, and then ultimately the FRA would issue a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. So just walking through some of the alternatives that were being considered in this environmental analysis is the no build. I mean, doing nothing, just remaining with the station that we have out there today. So this is just an aerial of the existing Amtrak station. There's the station there. There's the parking. And then the dash lines just delineate right-of-way. Here's some of the advantages of doing a no-build. I mean, it's where the station's at today. There's not going to be any capital costs. I mean, there's some benefits economically to the lower town district of Ann Arbor. It's pedestrian friendly. There's no impacts to parks or historic resources. Some of the disadvantages, however, it's not going to work very well for the passengers or the users. It doesn't meet ADA. It's really inadequate for the projected growth in either an expanded intercity commuter rail or commuter rail. Roadways are very congested in the area, and it's limited what you can do in terms of integrating access to, I guess, the greater region beyond Ann Arbor. So a couple of the alternatives that were also considered but we dismissed. We did not include these in the environmental assessment. This is what we call build alternatives 1A and 1B. This was the North Main Street alternatives. And so those, I think there was interest originally that these would facilitate some transit-oriented development, but the amount of space that we needed to program a station that was needed there was going to take all the developable land, so there wasn't going to be anything left. And so these got dismissed. The other alternatives, these what we call build alternative 3B, C, and D, these were just variations of alternatives that were included at Fuller Road. And these were dismissed because the footprints were, we wanted to make the footprint as small as possible at Fuller Road. These were larger, so we just dismissed them. We didn't even want to consider them. So this was our final list of build alternatives evaluated. You always include a no build, and then these were the actual build alternatives. So 2A, 2B, and 2C, those are all the ones that kind of are centric around the existing station, included a station over the tracks, a station on the ground, and then also the reuse of the Michigan Central station. And then lastly, the Fuller Road area in that south parking area. So this is just build alternative 2A. Again, you can see the elevated station, parking. This is nothing new. It's same information we had shown in the past. This is 2B. Again, this is a ground-based station with the station being right here in the orange. 2C is just the reuse of the Gandy Dancer, the Michigan Central station. So those were the three alternatives. Here's kind of a list of some of the advantages of each of these. Again, it's where the station currently is today, the economic benefits to the area. We would be able to make this ADA accessible. It's going to be able to accommodate commuter rail. It's pedestrian friendly. And would meet, at least the station would be able to meet the projected demand of that lot today, and so during construction, that would be disrupted. There's a need to relocate those parking spaces during construction, so we would have to come up with a parking mitigation plan in order to do that. Additionally, I think some of the other things that we're looking at is just trying to make the proposed facility as green, as environmentally friendly as possible, you know, through energy means, and then also in the way that we manage our stormwater. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. Again, we're soliciting comments through the second. We only had to do 30 days. They've extended it to 45 just because of the time lapse that we've had. Like I said, we have a couple copies of the EA here. There's one at the library. There's one at the clerk's office, and then certainly online. I think Eli would prefer email, but it'll also take them in writing. And then certainly, you know, I have some paper here if we want to provide comments here. We'll collect those and answer them. So what are their next steps? We're going to accept comments through the second. After the second, on November 3rd, we're going to go through all those comments and evaluate them, answer them, which would lead to that they would be part of the FONSI, the finding of no significant impact that we would develop with the FRA. Once that happens, I guess we would continue or start into preliminary engineering late this year. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And I guess if there's any questions, we can go through those now. And then lastly, we'll do some public comment. Okay.
Thank you, Bob. Sure. Please.
Just a quick one about the process here. So these are public meetings, but once the FRA makes its finding of no significant impact, so to speak, do they then hold the public hearing?
So that's the next stage of the process past the review of the EA is the publication of a draft FONSI, okay, the finding of no significant impact. That document itself is also subject to a public review process. So there will be, as my understanding, a statutory 30-day timeline where that document will be open to be commented upon. I believe that as the local project sponsor, we, the city, will continue to facilitate that public review process. But rest assured that as we have worked with the FRA on the grant application from the beginning all the way through today, that every comment that we receive will be submitted to FRA. I know some members of the community have taken to sending comments to me directly and then sending them to FRA. That's acceptable. We're not here to tell you how your voice should be heard, but that the process as it moves forward, we will continue to be the local public face. And so even the FONSI as a federal document that the FRA administrator ultimately will sign, we will be as part of the public review process as we will be. I'm not sure there will be public meetings. There's no requirement for public meetings or hearings on the FONSI, but that there will be a well-announced public review period for that document.
I got plenty more.
Keep going.
The other is the de minimis determination. That requires a public announcement and an opportunity for public comment to whoever is making that decision. And I don't know who makes the decision.
Let's try to break it down a couple of steps. So the 4F process prescribes a number of outcomes: waiver, de minimis, mitigation, use another alternative. It appears to us, MDOT and the FRA, that a de minimis finding at the preliminary level appears appropriate. The process to obtain a de minimis determination by the FRA does require a letter from the owner of the park resource. In this instance, the city of Ann Arbor owns the park, and that is our understanding in consultation with FRA. And as a project team, we've made a similar presentation to the PAC. I'm scheduled to go back to the PAC at their meeting later this month, and that we would be looking for the PAC being City's Park Advisory Commission. We would be looking for them to make a recommendation to City Council. Once we have concluded the public process, which is November 2nd, in terms of receiving comments, and if we have a resolution in hand, we would be at that point ready to go to City Council for them to consider whether they are going to authorize the execution of a FRA letter of acceptance to allow for these lands to be used to accommodate a transportation project. There's not a specific public process other than the considerations at the Park Advisory Commission. I think it's October 18th, next Wednesday. This item will also be presented to the city's newly formed Transportation Commission. They may or may not consider a resolution to council as it relates to the project in the broad sense and or a de minimis determination. That's a newly formed policy body, and they really have not been engaged in this process, as the Parks Advisory Commission has been involved from the very beginning, going back about 8 years ago. When I say involved, we have made regular reports, as we have with the LAG, to the Parks Advisory Commission. As I mentioned, they've already seen this presentation at their meeting in September. That's the process that we anticipate going through. I believe that it will meet or exceed FRA's requirements. And again, it's contingent upon the owner of the park executing a letter that FRA has formatted for our use to submit to them as part of their documentation. Because the end product of all of this, that FONSI, the finding no significant impact, is a determination made by the Federal Railroad Administration that they have provided environmental clearance that we can advance a transportation project at the preferred location. So what we're looking for is the regulatory approval, and the primary federal authority is the Federal Railroad Administration in their determination that we can continue to advance this project with their approval.
Okay, but what I want to make sure is that there is adequate public notice of these decision points, the PAC meeting and the council meeting, and an opportunity for public comment at those.
We are doing the best we can to get the message out with regard to the actual public notification. The fact is that each of those public meetings has its own notification requirements, and my expectation is that we will meet or exceed all of those statutory requirements by the virtue of the fact that for the stakeholders, so for the Leadership Advisory Group, for those interested citizens that signed on to be a part of the project, they're going to hear about all of this detail in the next day or two. So we are operating in as open a process as we can, and I believe far exceeding any of the process requirements that we would have to adhere to. This is Ann Arbor, and we're doing this in as transparent a manner as we can.
Thank you.
So, as far as Amtrak, what have they been involved in this process, and like going forward, what happens with Amtrak as well?
So Amtrak did send their regrets for not being able to be here with us this morning. They said if there are any questions of them, we could call them. We could actually call them right now if there was a specific question. Amtrak has been involved from before we even filed the first FRA grant application. The design specifications for all of the build alternatives were made using Amtrak's station design guidance. They have been at many of the prior meetings in terms of a variety of staff. I can't attest to who was at which meeting. And then we continue to coordinate with them as recently as 4:45 yesterday, where they realized they weren't going to make today's meeting. So this has been done in full cooperation with FRA, MDOT, Amtrak. The city's not out there saying, hey, we got this great idea, we want to do it. We are working with the ultimate end users, and
of that lot today, and so during construction, that would be disrupted. There's a need to relocate those parking spaces during construction, so we would have to come up with a parking mitigation plan in order to do that. Additionally, I think some of the other things that we're looking at is just trying to make the proposed facility as green, as environmentally friendly as possible, you know, through energy means, and then also in the way that we manage our stormwater. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. Again, we're soliciting comments through the second. We only had to do 30 days. They've extended it to 45 just because of the time lapse that we've had. Like I said, we have a couple copies of the EA here. There's one at the library. There's one at the clerk's office, and then certainly online. I think Eli would prefer email, but it'll also take them in writing. And then certainly, you know, I have some paper here if we want to provide comments here. We'll collect those and answer them. So what are their next steps? We're going to accept comments through the second. After the second, on November 3rd, we're going to go through all those comments and evaluate them, answer them, which would lead to that they would be part of the FONSI, the finding of no significant impact that we would develop with the FRA. Once that happens, I guess we would continue or start into preliminary engineering late this year. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And I guess if there's any questions, we can go through those now. And then lastly, we'll do some public comment. Okay.
thank you, Bob.
Sure.
Please.
Just a quick one about the process here. So these are public meetings, but once the FRA makes its finding of no significant impact, so to speak, do they then hold the public hearing?
So that's the next stage of the process past the review of the EA is the publication of a draft FONSI, okay, the finding of no significant impact. That document itself is also subject to a public review process. So there will be, as my understanding, a statutory 30-day timeline where that document will be open to be commented upon. I believe that as the local project sponsor, we, the city, will continue to facilitate that public review process. But rest assured that as we have worked with the FRA on the grant application from the beginning all the way through today, that every comment that we receive will be submitted to FRA. I know some members of the community have taken to sending comments to me directly and then sending them to FRA. That's acceptable. We're not here to tell you how your voice should be heard, but that the process as it moves forward, we will continue to be the local public face. And so even the FONSI as a federal document that the FRA administrator ultimately will sign, we will be as part of the public review process as we will be. I'm not sure there will be public meetings. There's no requirement for public meetings or hearings on the FONSI, but that there will be a well-announced public review period for that document.
I've got plenty more.
Keep going.
The other is the de minimis determination. That requires a public announcement and an opportunity for public comment to whoever's making that decision. And I don't know who makes the decision.
Let's try to break it down a couple of steps. So the 4F process prescribes a number of outcomes: waiver, de minimis, mitigation, use another alternative. It appears to us, MDOT and the FRA, that a de minimis finding at the preliminary level appears appropriate. The process to obtain a de minimis determination by the FRA does require a letter from the owner of the park resource. In this instance, the city of Ann Arbor owns the park, and that is our understanding in consultation with FRA. And as a project team, we've made a similar presentation to the PAC. I'm scheduled to go back to the PAC at their meeting later this month, and that we would be looking for the city's Park Advisory Commission. We would be looking for them to make a recommendation to City Council. Once we have concluded the public process, which is November 2nd, in terms of receiving comments, and if we have a resolution in hand, we would be at that point ready to go to City Council for them to consider whether they are going to authorize the execution of a FRA letter of acceptance to allow for these lands to be used to accommodate a transportation project. There's not a specific public process other than the considerations at the Park Advisory Commission. I think it's October 18th, next Wednesday. This item will also be presented to the city's newly formed Transportation Commission. They may or may not consider a resolution to council as it relates to the project in the broad sense and/or a de minimis determination. That's a newly formed policy body, and they really have not been engaged in this process, as the Parks Advisory Commission has been involved from the very beginning, going back about 8 years ago. When I say involved, we have made regular reports, as we have with the LAG, to the Parks Advisory Commission. As I mentioned, they've already seen this presentation at their meeting in September. That's the process that we anticipate going through. I believe that it will meet or exceed FRA's requirements. And again, it's contingent upon the owner of the park executing a letter that FRA has formatted for our use to submit to them as part of their documentation. Because the end product of all of this, that FONSI, the finding no significant impact, is a determination made by the Federal Railroad Administration that they have provided environmental clearance that we can advance a transportation project at the preferred location. So what we're looking for is regulatory approval, and the primary federal authority is the Federal Railroad Administration in their determination that we can continue to advance this project with their approval.
Okay, but what I want to make sure is that there is adequate public notice of these decision points, the PAC meeting and the council meeting, and an opportunity for public comment at those.
We are doing the best we can to get the message out with regard to the actual public notification. The fact is that each of those public meetings has its own notification requirements, and my expectation is that we will meet or exceed all of those statutory requirements by the virtue of the fact that for the stakeholders, so for the Leadership Advisory Group, for those interested citizens that signed on to be a part of the project, they're going to hear about all of this detail in the next day or two. So we are operating in as open a process as we can, and I believe far exceeding any of the process requirements that we would have to adhere to. This is Ann Arbor, and we're doing this in as transparent a manner as we can.
Thank you.
Eli? So, as far as Amtrak, what, have they been involved in this process, and like going forward, what happens with Amtrak as well?
So Amtrak did send their regrets for not being able to be here with us this morning. They said if there are any questions of them, we could call them, and we could actually call them right now if there was a specific question. Amtrak has been involved from before we even filed the first FRA grant application. The design specifications for all of the build alternatives were made using Amtrak's station design guidance. They have been at many of the prior meetings in terms of a variety of staff. I can't attest to who was at which meeting. And then we continue to coordinate with them as recently as 4:45 yesterday, where they realized they weren't going to make today's meeting. So this has been done in full cooperation with FRA, MDOT, Amtrak. The city's not out there saying, hey, we got this great idea, we want to do it. We are working with the ultimate end users and speculative real estate industry, so I don't know the minimization of the flood impact on the land south of the corridor, the actual elevations and what type of construction technique. Those would be issues for Amtrak, subsequent interested parties, and perhaps DTE Energy as they look to reuse or use the lands that they have in their ownership. Our interest is environmental clearance for advancing a public train station project.
I can come up with more. I guess.
We have the room until 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
And if anyone else has any questions, I'd be happy. If
Can I,
not,
can I ask one? When would this go to the U of M Regents or to a public vote?
okay, since this is a city project, I do not aware of what the U of M Regents would be considering relative to the projects, especially at this early phase where, again, we're looking for addressing the federal requirements to identify the preferred location. The City Council did years ago, as part of agreeing to accept the federal funding for this planning and environmental phase, indicate that they would put this matter before the public for a vote. And I've seen it in some of the news reporting, and I don't have the specific language. It was at or before the final design process. So let me say to you that we're still in the environmental assessment or environmental review. Subsequent to this phase of work, we have already funded, and it's called the preliminary engineering. Once preliminary engineering is complete, and that typically gets you to about 30% project plans, there would be a subsequent final design phase. And so the council's resolution allows for the item being put forward to a public vote 2 steps beyond where we are right now. We could, as a community, decide after we have a preferred location and sufficiently detailed information that might come out of preliminary engineering to put it before the citizens for a vote, but that we have the focus for today is the review of the public environmental assessment, and those are well known to all interested in the community, and we are committed, as it is council resolution, it's our direction that there will be a vote. I just don't have the ability to tell you when.
Thanks.
At what point, so I guess maybe it's engineering, that the determination is made for road improvements in that area? Because, I mean, if we're gonna have additional buses probably going through there, you know, would there be considerations for bus lanes?
So when you say that area, again, to be clear, this is in the proximity of the preferred alternative?
Yes.
So at this point, the city's capital improvement program shows that let me take a step back. The transportation impact study that's a part of the EA describes that there's a need for some improvements based on existing traffic patterns at the Fuller East Medical intersection. The city is well aware of that. There are design plans for an intersection improvement, and that those are in the city's capital improvement program for FY 2021. So that those improvements that are necessitated by traffic patterns already in existence would be made about 3-4 years from now, and that the traffic engineering reports that are associated with this project have evaluated the capacity that those improvements would make, and it can accommodate the additional traffic that would be generated by a train station. Beyond those public improvements at the Fuller East Medical intersection, there are driveway and crossover improvements that would be installed as part of this project. Those would be timed commensurate with and consistent with the development of the project following the public vote when funding's available. So there are a couple of different phases, and I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and there are 2 parts in the report that are a little bit contradictory in that they say that there is no impact on the Site 2, the depot site, to the Wheeler Park or business like Casey's. However, in the appendix, when they look at the traffic situation, they said, you know, this is such a mess on Depot Street that would have to be widened. And that would have an impact. So you've got, you know, kind of both things in there.
So, and I appreciate the question, and as the city's transportation program manager, there are no projects programmed on Depot Street. The traffic impact study related to this report looked at what potential improvements could be made to address the congestion that is been defined as problematic relative to the site. In order to create the turning lane capacity at the intersection of Depot and North Main, there would be private property park impacts. And that's what's described in the technical report. But since those are not on the city's radar screen, and my belief is that it's unlikely that we would even program taking private property and impacting public parks to merely widen a roadway. And so the issue is, there's no conflict. It's each of the reports are accurate as written. The traffic impact study speculates what could it take to address this. And then what is in the EA itself is the fact that for the Fuller East Medical intersection, well-studied, known, improvement feasible and programmed. For the Depot Street area, there are no considerations, because my suspicion is, and I've been with the city for over a decade now, there's never been discussion of addressing this area. I worked with the project team and said, look, we can't just have a blind eye to that. What would it take? And they did go further and looked at a double left turn lane and what the receiving lane and roadway widths would need to be. And that's part of the analysis that underpins the challenges that exist for the Depot Street alternatives.
So therefore, there's no real solution to the congestion problem that even exists today. And then you look at the future additional employment in the vicinity plus the station, if it were built there, that you would have even worse problems than you have now. Because it backs up now quite frequently right to the station. And it's hard for any people to get in and out of the parking lot.
And part of that is, again, Bob did he explained what some of the drawbacks of the Depot Street alternatives was. That is one of them. We understand and are able, and there is feasibility to make improvements to the Broadway corridor to address the safety and accessibility access issues for Broadway. But for the Depot Street, we know there's an issue. We looked at it in enough detail to say what could theoretically be done, and come to realize that you would be addressing widening multiple structures, acquiring properties well beyond the scope of the EA for this project, and costs that would likely run into the millions, if not tens of millions of dollars, should the city, and we would have to cooperate with MDOT, because the North Main corridor is not a city corridor, that's an MDOT trunk line. So there are any of a number of complexities to trying to actually plan and implement improvements to overcome that traffic congestion issue that we live with today.
Thank you.
But those would be issues regardless of whether you built a new station anyplace anyway. I mean, that congestion is there, and it looked like it was projected to continue to be a problem, so no matter where you built the station, that's an issue.
Again, as a city's transportation program manager, yes, we have a congestion issue along the Depot Street corridor, and more specifically at the intersection of North Main and Depot. Those issues affect those motorists, commuters, citizens that rely on that corridor. The issue that we have is in considering the ideal, best, suitable location for not the current train station, but a future train station, is the traffic significant matter that needs to be taken into account. And if it is, and I believe we would all agree that it is, the issue is, are there strategies and solutions? And that's what the depot process required us to identify. And that for the Depot Street alternatives, those intersection and roadway capacity issues are defined as existing, and that there are no plans to remedy those, so that becomes a factor of the decision. See you handing back in?
Sorry. As a point of clarification, for the preferred site, one of the disadvantages was that it's impacts 4.7 acres of Fuller Park. But I guess there seems to be some confusion amongst people as far as that is currently a parking lot, right?
Right. It is primarily, and again, you have to wade through the detail of the report. The parking lot itself is not 4.7 acres.
Okay.
There are drive entrances that will need to be expanded in order to provide the appropriate access to get in and out of the future Ann Arbor station should be located there.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a, what I'll call a station plaza. So the platforms and the like will be on the MDOT right of way. The actual parking structure or intermodal facility would be constrained east and west, but there's still going to be pedestrian linkages that connect in a north-south direction between the existing parking area and the future access to the railroad itself.
Okay.
So the 4.7 describes the entire footprint, not merely the east and west dimensions, but it also includes lands that were in the concept drawings north and south of those east and west points.
Right. So people I've talked to are confused because they think that it's going to incorporate the park across the street as well. So when people are saying this is parkland, they think that it's going to also incorporate what's across Fuller as far as what Fuller Park is. And so I think that's where some confusion is as far as, because it's not parkland right now, it's mostly parking lot.
So appreciate that clarification, and I appreciate the question, so I can offer that clarification, but I want to be abundantly clear. In the EA report, there are dimensions including visual impacts to suggest that creating a structure or a project of this nature on that land would have absolutely no effect on the land north of the roadway would be disingenuous. So
Okay, but it doesn't include that.
does not
Okay,
include
yes.
that, but it will
Right.
have an effect upon it.
One of the disadvantages you mentioned about the depot site was a temporary effect on the border-to-border trail and on the Huron River Trail. But you didn't mention that in the proposed alternative, there would be temporary staging on the remainder of Fuller Park on the south, which is also an effect on the park land. So I just want to point that out.
So to the extent that we have included the area for the temporary parking there, so the fact is that the EA anticipates staging occurring within the project site and actually using the lands that are currently the soccer field on the south side. Those are already identified within the report, so I believe that we are being as clear as we can for the impact on park users. There's not, well, this is going to have an effect here.
That in the proposed alternative, there would be temporary staging on the remainder of Fuller Park on the south, which is also an effect on the park land. So I just want to point that out.
So to the extent that we have included the area for the temporary parking there, so the fact is that the EA anticipates staging occurring within the project site and actually using the lands that are currently the soccer field on the south side. Those are already identified within the report, so I believe that we are being as clear as we can for the impact on park users. There's not, well, this is going to have an effect here and no effect there. I think that what we've done is work with the park staff and identify those issues of interest to our Parks Department, and those are well reported within the document itself.
I agree they were reported, but it wasn't valued the same in the decision document. So it was a detriment on the depot site, but it was not addressed in the side-by-side kind of comparison for points that would support the Fuller site.
I appreciate that comment.
Okay. As a user of all these streets that we're talking about, there is difficulty at Main and Depot. I go through it regularly. I do not have a problem. It's not great. It's not a great place to be. However, it almost doesn't compare with the difficulty at Fuller and Maiden Lane, that where they're thinking about a roundabout, and the difficulty at Glen and Huron, which is at capacity and beyond intersection. And so using Fuller as a street to carry traffic, I think there are great difficulties. And, you know, for me as a person in town who drives these streets, I would say Maiden Lane and Glen are really major problems.
Thank you for that comment.
What other design options did you consider for the Broadway Bridge?
When you say other design options, we began by looking at the current configuration and the identification of where the drive access to the properties, and I'll use that term, could be located. And there are substantial grade issues. We have the river, we've got elevations. So once we knew where we could intersect with the streets, the question is, given the volumes on the roadway and the volumes of the land use, what design is necessary to allow for safe and efficient access? That brought us to a need for the left turning lane. It brought the need for the right turning lane to meet the appropriate roadway design specifications. Beyond that, we also took a look at transit operations and saw that there was a need for transit operations in order to align the buses running on the Broadway bridges directly with curbside drop-off. So those features were acknowledged, and I can let Bob talk in more detail about how many permutations, but it was abundantly clear that we wanted to have the bus pull-offs as close in proximity to the station directly as we could, and that since we only had a single location for the drive and we knew what the geometrics were, the intent was to have all improvements programmed to the west side of the corridor, recognizing the east side of the bridges is Broadway Park, so that since there's no parkland and there was adequate width not to affect historic structures on the west side of the roadway, that was the preferred design option. And I'm not sure that there were other considerations, but I'll ask Bob. What did you guys think about when you were back in the kitchen?
Well, the needs there was a northbound left turn. And then on the southbound side, we needed a southbound dedicated right turn lane to get into the driveway that's there.
You're talking about Broadway at the current long-term parking area.
Right. And it would be, in about the same proposed location. Some of the challenges there, as Eli just described on the east side, is Broadway Park. So we didn't want to impact there. So I guess we held that line and expanded everything to the west. Because, well, not only Broadway Park, but then there's also the Michigan Central Station south of the tracks. So you have parkland on the east side, and then you're also nestled between two bridges, a structure over the Huron River, the structure over the railroad track. So you were limited in what you could do there. We tried to minimize the footprint, as much as we could, while still meeting, turn lanes, taper lengths, needed to accommodate the traffic.
Did you ever consider making a left turn lane directly into the parking lot going northbound? Because you did indicate that there would be a traffic signal there.
Yeah.
And that could be used for a left turn for buses going in to drop out at grade at the train station in either sites 2A, versions 2A or 2B.
this is what we're proposing, and it's pretty much the same for each one of them. So here is your northbound left, here's your southbound right. You can see we're pretty much holding this edge, and then this area here, here's where the widening is. And then there's, Eli talked about the bus bays here, wanting to get them as close to the station as possible, but at least the intersection here, yes, it would be signalized. Here's our northbound left, a dedicated left, and a dedicated right.
So if, I'm just suggesting that the widening of the bridge over the tracks where you show the buses pulling off
Right here.
could be eliminated, and that the buses could go straight to that signal and into the lot and do their drop-off and have a lot less engineering and construction.
So
And expense.
I appreciate that as a design consideration. Understand that earlier question about how has Amtrak been engaged in the process. Amtrak has, and there are footnotes that provide you access to the links. They have station design guidelines. One of the important criteria that they have is that public transit access be separated from private vehicle access for a variety of reasons. And so although there's a potential for buses to make the actual turning movements into the intermodal or the parking structure in this instance, that's not the intended purpose, that this would be the private vehicle access into the parking structure, and that in all of the depot street alternatives, the transit intermodal operation would occur in what's currently the Amtrak parking lot. So that although I could agree with you that buses could make that move, the facilities are not being designed so the vertical clearance in the garage structure would likely be different. I recall from an earlier project that if you're going to have bus operations within an intermodal structure, the base elevation needs to be 17 feet of vertical clearance to allow for air circulation.
And that's what you're doing on Fuller.
That's what's the concept for Fuller. But if we go back, Bob, can you bring up the Fuller? What you'll note in the Fuller design is there are two separate entrances, and that the one entrance is designated on the concept drawing for bus only. So that we are adhering to Amtrak's design recommendations to separate private vehicle access from transit access. So you may not be able to see this where you're sitting, but there's white text on the dark roadway that says bus only, and this would be the primary and exclusive private vehicle access way.
Except the buses would be coming out of that.
To be determined. The answer is that the bus-only drive road shows both incoming and outbound traffic. And I think that this is an issue that really does need further analysis and preliminary engineering, but this is the concept that adheres to the degree possible Amtrak's design guidance in this area. In the back, somebody new?
Yeah, I apologize. I had to put my kids in school, so a little late. Somebody asked my question, and please accept my apologies in advance. So, you know, when I look at the people in town, and I've been consulting a lot of people about this project, and a lot of people come in and give their opinions about it. It seems to me that they're divided into kind of three camps. I'd say roughly one-third, one-third, one-third. There's like a third of the people in our community who they totally support mass transit, and they would pay increased taxes to do that, and they think the train station is a great idea, wherever it goes. Okay? And then there's about a third who they are totally against mass transit. They vote against every tax increase, and they don't care what you're doing or where you're doing it, and they don't want it. Okay? Then there's about a third in the middle who are what we call the persuadables, and they think that the idea of a new train station is a wonderful idea as long as the city, whose resources are stretched, doesn't invest a penny in it. Okay? That the money comes from the federal government or U of M or some combination thereof or some other source. Okay? So when I look at that conundrum, it seems to me like the only solution to actually get majority support from our community for a project which I think is potentially very good for our community in the long run is to figure out how do we come up with a 20% match in a way that doesn't impact the city fiscally. Right? So, you know, I've made the suggestion repeatedly in public and to city council and to the mayor that we should look at selling the air rights above this location that's on the screen here. And I run that by various different community leaders, including, for example, Arbor is the CEO of McKinley, which is the largest real estate owner and developer in our community. And he thinks it's a fantastic idea. And I agree. I mean, I'm president of a bank that manages $20 billion and does $750 million of real estate lending every year. And I think that if you sold the air rights to that large light blue structure there, allowed the private developers to build a tall building on top, you would raise all the money that you need to actually provide the match without dipping a penny into the city's coffers. And then if you put that proposal forward to the voters, I think it would fly like an eagle. And you wouldn't have a big fight, and you wouldn't take the chance to lose it. And I think that all the decision makers in this process need to be realistic about the fact that this needs to go to a vote of the voters. And if you put an ask on for money, it's going to fail. Whereas if you say it's a free thing, other people are paying for it, it will pass. And my question to you is, in this work that we've done so far, several $1 million, was there any consideration given whatsoever to putting a stronger foundation on this light blue structure so that you could build up 10 stories or 12 stories? And is it irrevocably at this point past that it can't be done based upon the work that's been done?
I'm going to answer your second question first and suggest to you that the answer to that is no. There's been no irrevocable decisions about future design or foundation footprints, etc. I want to take it back a step and acknowledge that you had arrived after the meeting started. The purpose of the stage and the process that we are in right now is to obtain the FRA determination for the use of a preferred location. The detail of information that you're seeing in terms of concept drawings and cost estimates related to those drawings are what's the actionable item for us to discuss today and for us to bring, us as the community within that, to bring to FRA. If, as we go through the preliminary engineering process, if, as we go through subsequent discussions with clarification or clearance to use the site, additional features may come into consideration. But from the standpoint of the current grant that we're operating under, the authorizations that we need in order to receive the Federal Railroad Administration's clearance for a particular location. At this point, we have a draft EA with a preliminary preferred. The word in the FONSI changes to selected alternative. Once a site is selected, we can perhaps look at other issues. And so, again, to be clear, that the discussion that you're contemplating has not been part of the deliberations to date. Let me take a step aside and say, as the City Transportation Program Manager, that the matter of the location within a park will have a direct effect to how any project, be it a federally supported rail project or something that's what I would call a combined joint use development. The city charter is clear in terms of the use of parkland or the transfer of parkland, and so that is not part of anything that we are looking at with regard to the station project. And your view as to what the citizens may support or not is not at this point something that I have comment on, because quite frankly what we're focusing on are the 20 NEPA criterion and how we obtain the federal government. Frankly, what we're focusing on are the 20 NEPA criterion and how we obtain the federal government. I think everyone has acknowledged that as the city started into this process, that the historic federal local share is about 80-20. So we're still trying to get our ducks in a row to have access to the federal funding to support this project. The remaining detail is clearly work that will be in front of us as we go through the various stages of design. And part of the attributes of the design process is to actually lay out a financial pro forma and a commitment of where the local funding would come from. That is not an element of the EA phase of the federal process.
So Eli, I really appreciate your comments. I think that really helps me in understanding, you know, where you're at, what you're trying to accomplish, and what your constraints are. So, you know, my further comment on that then is, you know, whereas this location adjacent to the U of M hospital complex economically would allow for what I just described, you know, coming up with $16 million for a down payment towards the 20% match, you know, because you could build a $100 million building on top, and that would justify the expense. Okay, just like with the downtown library lot, the city has sold for $10 million the air rights above a garage. Okay, so there's a precedent already in our town, although I personally feel that that one was a bad precedent because the city actually lost money on it, $18 million loss on it, but whatever. But there's a precedent for successfully selling air rights in our town in a quality location. The issue is that the Depot Town location does not have those economics, does not have that business case or business justification. It cannot be done there in the current economic environment. There is no sufficient demand from the private sector to build on that location, and such a project would fail. So, you know, the alternatives here about the siting are, if you go with this site at Fuller, you could actually end up with a project that the city taxpayers do not have to invest a penny in, whereas if you went with the other site, the city taxpayers would have to come up with all $16 million of it, because certainly the U of M isn't going to contribute to a project that's a third of a mile away from the U of M hospital complex and not near their central campus.
Appreciate that point of view and that comment. Have a question?
Yeah, just kind of following up on that, the discussion in the EA about transit-oriented development indicated that in fact the depot site was an appropriate area for that, and it rightly indicated that the Fuller Park site horizontally there are not options, and it hinted at possible.
So related to that, though, the cost of the structure would change if it was going to be reinforced to support a large building on top. And those costs are not in what we see now.
So I want to be careful as we talk about cost. And first, I'm just going to agree to say that as best as I'm aware, that the costs that are reflected are concept level cost estimates. And that the concept level cost estimates, if you look at the science of cost estimation, are plus or minus 50%. And that they are top-down unit costs. So what is the cost of providing X parking spaces multiplied by $35,000, $40,000 per space? You come up with the number or the square footage in a parking structure. There is no elevations. There are no specific foundation designs or structural designs as part of the cost estimate. They're high-level concept cost estimates. Now, they do fill up a couple of cells in a spreadsheet because there are various components, utilities, structure, station, but it's not been defined as what I would call from the bottom up, from the ground to what type of grading is necessary with quantification of that grading to where there's costs that are allocated specifically based on known contracts. This is a preliminary cost estimate. The important piece for the process that we're in now is that the same cost estimation process went forward for all of the alternatives, and as such they are directly comparable with the same accuracy among those, but that there has been no consideration of buttressing a foundation in order to support additional development. Those types of considerations, if they were to occur, would be part of the actual design process. Let me comfort some people and maybe discomfort others in that in conversation with the FRA, although we're looking at being in a position to apply for a FONSI upon completion of the EA process, we are still in consultation with FRA as to how far we need to get into the preliminary engineering process in order to have sufficient detail in order for them to issue and sign off on a FONSI. So at this point, I can't answer the question. Once, and we did start some preliminary engineering work, and I understand the complexity of preliminary engineering versus conceptual drawings. And I can't say to you exactly when the FRA will issue the draft FONSI and how much detail that they're going to require of us before they issue such documents. Take one in the front and we'll work our way back.
So I understand the process and, high level, correct me if I'm wrong. Once, at this stage, once the NEPA analysis settles on a selected option, then that will allow the process to move forward into preliminary design work. In preliminary design work, there's still 2 more stages that gets into cost, that gets into a higher level understanding of what a site could perform to and the standards that it can perform to. And then once that is submitted to FRA for project approval, then you have a final design process that actually has 2 levels where you start with the actual preliminary design drawings and engineering work that goes along with that, and preliminary cost estimates. And then you get into the final design work in which you start selecting from community alternatives, how it's going to be paid for, the realization and finalization of drawings. And so, as I understand the process, there's at least 4 or 5 steps in this to go from concept to something that a community would have enough detail to have a vote or a selected option to see and to understand the full impacts. And along the way, every single time that environmental or NEPA analysis is then adjusted to that final design.
I think we're in agreement with you is that there are subsequent phases that require approvals, whether it be city council, whether it be FRA, and the approvals might be for grant funding, as an example, so that the current agreement that we're under requires us to complete through preliminary engineering, but it does not enable final design. And final design is a separate process, and then construction would be a separate process beyond that. Where I can't absolutely agree with you is I don't use cited 4 particular steps in the process. I'm not familiar with that much detail to say that there are substantial steps and applications and approvals that we would receive. I think what I do want to make clear to the group is that the EA, once it is executed, would serve as the basis for the work that would be cleared under that document. If and only if the project would change such that it was substantially different than that which has been approved, would we reopen the environmental review process. So that's kind of